Hello Gates. He loathed Paul McCartney so deeply that for years no one knew the real reason. The man didn't just dislike him, he hated him, and today we're going to see why. Here's a surprising fact: when Phil Collins met McCartney at a Buckingham Palace event in 2002, McCartney addressed him with the words, "Our little Phil's a bit of a Beatles fan." That throwaway phrase sparked a resentment that lasted 14 years. This matters because behind that one moment lies a web of rivalry, ego, shattered friendships, and unspoken hurt that changes how we see one of music's greatest legends. If you think you know McCartney, think again and stay with me, because what comes next will flip the story you thought you understood. And now, let's get into the full story of why the hate ran so deep and what it reveals about fame, friendship, and power. Let's rewind to 2002. Phil Collins, a celebrated musician in his own right, approaches Paul McCartney at a high-profile event. He asks for an autograph. Instead of a friendly greeting, McCartney comments to his wife, "Our little Phil's a bit of a Beatles fan." To many, that's an innocent remark. But to Collins, it felt like condescension. "I thought, you fuck," he later recalled. That moment lit something inside him, a feeling that McCartney, intentionally or not, saw himself above the rest. Collins says the resentment lasted for 14 years. This is where the title claim, "He hated Paul McCartney more than anyone knew," starts to make sense. It wasn't just a minor irritation. It was a deep-rooted feeling of "you don't see me, you don't respect me," and everything that followed grew out of that. But this wasn't just about one karaoke moment. There's a broader pattern. Critics have argued that McCartney's personality and public image sometimes bred contempt. For example, some dismissed his music as bland or safe, accusing him of being the pop pleaser, while others in his era were seen as revolutionary. And with Collins, he felt that slight in that moment was emblematic. He viewed McCartney's attitude as subtly making others feel smaller, not because they were bad musicians, but because McCartney was McCartney. So for Collins, the act of asking for an autograph turned into a symbol of something much bigger, a talent overshadowed, a peer dismissed. That feeling of being dismissed turned into bitterness, which turned into what he says was hatred. Now let's go deeper. With McCartney, there were other cracks behind the scenes. For instance, his relationship with John Lennon was fraught with resentment and rivalry. Lennon envied McCartney's ability to write melodies like Yesterday and Hey Jude. "It bugged him that Paul could write those sweet melodies," said Lennon's former aide. McCartney himself admitted the post-Beatles period was pretty hurtful. What we see is two tiers: the personal slight, Collins versus McCartney, and the legacy battle, McCartney's internal and external conflicts. Both running in parallel. For Collins, the hurt was personal and public yet unrecognized. He felt overshadowed by McCartney's status and perhaps by the world's admiration of McCartney. For McCartney, he was managing crushing expectations, labels of Beatle, legend, the guy who always had to be great. He wielded power, maybe unknowingly, but that power cast shadows. That convergence creates a potent mix of resentment. Collins wasn't just angry at one remark, he was angry at the symbol that remark represented. What does that hatred look like in day-to-day life? It shows up in small moments, big reveals, awkward silences, and public hints. Collins didn't publicly crusade against McCartney, but the resentment was real. In interviews he revealed how that one event stuck with him and shaped his view. McCartney, on the other hand, may not have recognized the depth of the damage. He reached out, but according to Collins, the apology was more along the lines of "let's just get on with our lives" rather than a full acknowledgement. What this tells us is that sometimes what looks like harmless banter is heavy with meaning in the artist world. When one legend meets another, the slightest gesture can echo for years. So why should you care about a feud between two rock icons? Because it reveals how power, ego, identity, and legacy operate in the shadows of greatness. When you're standing next to one of the most famous musicians of all time, every whisper, every side comment becomes amplified. For Collins, the story shows how even someone highly successful can feel invisible next to a mythic figure. For McCartney, it shows how greatness can isolate you and make your actions, even accidental ones, carry enormous weight. And from a broader vantage, if a small moment like this can grow into a 14-year resentment between legends, imagine the untold stories in other walks of life, between colleagues, friends, rivals. This is the story behind the headline, "He hated Paul McCartney more than anyone knew." It wasn't just about Collins or McCartney. It was about what happens when human beings collide with icons, when talent meets legacy, when ego meets respect. So here's the deal. Now that you've heard how a single dismissive phrase turned into long-standing hatred, how a giant in music inadvertently cast a shadow over another, and how legacy can be a double-edged sword, ask yourself, who's carrying resentment in your life right now? Who's the iconic figure making you feel small? Maybe it's not a superstar, maybe it's someone close.